Welcome back. Here we are at Lecture 28. Because of the way I've organized this course, we've tried to stay with each topic we've considered long enough to do it justice. That's meant that occasionally we've had to do several passes over a single set of decades. One pass to deal with connected topics in biological science, for example, and then later we came back to catch up on what was happening in the physical sciences. Take the events we talked about in the last two lectures, the discovery of electromagnetism and Fourier and Carnot's novel ideas about the behavior of heat. All that happened during the same years in France when Cuvier's prehistoric beasts were thrilling audiences and when Lamarck was defending his theory of evolution. In Britain, Faraday rose to prominence during the decade when the arguments over Neptunism and volcanism gave rise to the catastrophic synthesis of William Buckland, and the young Charles Darwin set off to travel around the world. Now, along the way, though through some of this material, I've had several occasions to mention, if only very briefly, that here in the early decades of the 19th century, natural science was beginning to emerge into a form much closer to the one we recognize in the 21st century. I've made references to scholars who've observed that this is the time when natural philosophers were becoming clear about what being scientific meant. And I've also noted in passing, this was the time when natural philosophers successfully communicated a consensus about that to the public at large. Well, all those brief allusions were necessary to support points I was making at the time. But today, we're finally going to give this subject of the emergence of natural science from natural philosophy its full due. We're going to see the appearance of the scientist, a recognized practitioner of natural science for the first time. Back in Lecture 14, we considered the different alternative visions of natural science that graced the landscape of the early 19th century. We observed that there was at that time no one scientific approach to the investigation of nature. There were competing claims for that label. Let me review some of these different visions of natural philosophy that existed in the early decades of the 1800s. There were those like Georges Cuvier in France who insisted that gathering empirical information from which generalizations about nature could be formed was the primary responsibility of the investigator of nature. To Cuvier, it was a straightforward, simple matter. But to his senior colleague, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, natural philosophy was not so straightforward as all that. He complained that the mere gathering of facts ignored the need to bring ideas to the interrogation of nature. Of course, that sounded like prejudice to Cuvier, who dismissed Lamarck's approach as unfounded dogmatic speculation. Lamarck once replied to such criticism by observing, and these are his words, "Those who would conclude that in the study of nature we must always limit ourselves to amassing facts resemble an architect who would advise always cutting stones, preparing mortar, wood, ironwork, etc., and who would never dare to employ these materials to construct an edifice." So Lamarck thought Cuvier was being naive to think he could simply go out and gather facts. In the German states, nature philosophers urged that the accumulation of information in order to test some idea about nature's mechanisms was seeing nature only from the outside. They believed firmly that you needed to include as well the special knowledge humans possessed because they were part of nature. This led Schelling to champion replacing the image of nature as a machine with that of an organism. And that made possible the inclusion into natural philosophy of both an aesthetic and moral agency that was largely absent in the strictly mechanical approach. One historian of science has recently characterized this inclusion of moral agency in the pursuit of knowledge of the world as sentimental empiricism. She intends to capture by that phrase the emotional commitments that natural philosophers traditionally brought even to their empirical observations of nature. So there were different general visions of natural philosophy. Finally, I must note that the first 2 decades of the 19th century also saw the flowering of numerous specific movements that wished to associate themselves with natural science. We've already examined the origins of mesmerism in the late 18th century. Well, mesmerism continued to flourish throughout the 19th century, spawning derivative movements involving somnambulism and the like. And mesmerism wasn't alone. In 1798, the respected physician Franz Joseph Gall introduced his system of phrenology to German readers in a leading journal. And over the course of the next decade, he proceeded to elaborate on it and to see it widely praised. I mentioned to you how popular this movement became in England. Its basic message was that natural law ruled everywhere, even in regulating our mental capacities. Following almost exactly the same chronology, Samuel Hahnemann introduced what he called a new principle for finding the healing powers of substances in a noted medical journal in 1796, then followed it in 1806 and in 1810 with full articulations of his system of homeopathy. That too demonstrated incredible staying power. So you can see what I mean when I say that there was no common agreement in society in the early 19th century about what being scientific meant. Lots of folks were claiming they were scientific, but they often meant very different things by the term. And all this was taking place at a time when Europe itself had been turned upside down. The old regime in France had been dismantled by the revolution, and in its aftermath, Napoleon Bonaparte proceeded to conquer Europe in order to make way for his vision of what the world should look like. That, of course, continued to disrupt traditional political and economic structures that were already under enormous strain because of the Industrial Revolution that was in full sway. And that, as much as anything, made the working classes increasingly aware of their own unfavorable situation. So, with the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815, when Europe began the process of trying to put itself back together, so much had changed and was continuing to change that putting Europe back together wasn't going to be an easy task. Let me mention one more factor in all this. In a sense, this factor, which was predominantly a feature of the growing middle class, was a vehicle by which all this change was being evaluated. I'm talking about the emergence of what scholars have called a public sphere in the middle class. I've already made use of this phrase in these lectures. A defining feature of the public sphere was the acknowledgement that argument, not status, should determine authentic social authority. In the past, what the king decreed required no further justification because the king was the king and he possessed complete authority. But with the emergence of a public sphere, and with it something called public opinion, the king's authority was eroded because now there was a public opinion about whether the king's action had been reasonable. Wherever it had come from, the public sphere was definitely a part of a new reality. In the German states, one measure of the emergence of a public sphere was the proliferation of journals of all kinds, which had been underway since the late 18th century. I want to focus on the German situation because it was here in the fluid situation of post-Napoleonic Europe that a new idea of a scientific community began to take shape. It was actually the founding of a new journal of natural science that marked an early step in the process of solidifying the scientific community. And the key individual here is one of the nature philosophers, one of the followers of Friedrich Schelling. I'm speaking of a zoologist named Lawrence Oken. Oken had climbed up the ranks of academe from meager beginnings as the son of a farmer. He was obviously very intelligent, but it was his fiery personality that drove him to succeed. And that same personality got him into politics as well. Oken simply couldn't sit still when he saw something he felt had to be changed. He was a man of action who didn't want to miss the chance for change and progress that he saw lying before the German states. That's why he took a lead in the politically charged atmosphere of post-Napoleonic years, of those years. Oken had been trained in zoology and he valued the romantic vision of natural philosophy that Schelling had made popular during the first decade of the century. In fact, he became known as one of the leading nature philosophers of the day. That involved him in debates with those who did not share his vision of nature philosophy. But Oken loved debate and argument. He never shied away from public discussion. Oken came to embody the values of the new public sphere, especially the value that said that you should question authority and let open argument prevail. After Napoleon had been defeated in 1815, Oken determined that he would establish a new journal devoted primarily to the natural sciences as a means of instructing the public in the proper route to truth. He would let the public see how things were done in natural science. He called the journal Isis, we would say Isis, named for the Egyptian goddess of nature. And it proved to be an immediate success. Clearly, there were a lot of people who agreed with him that open discussion was important. Oken claimed to print virtually everything that was sent to him, including occasional vitriolic criticisms of himself. And he did so under the assumption that the truth would prevail in the jury of public opinion. Now, although the focus of the articles was natural science, political issues began to appear in Isis as well. It was a politically tense time in Europe, especially in the German states. Many of the young men who had gone off to fight in the wars of liberation against Napoleon came home determined that Germany should never be dominated again by a foreign power. And that meant to them that Germany had to be united. The German states could not compete militarily with great powers like France if they continued to exist in these separate states. The students organized fraternities as they came back to the university education that had been interrupted by the wars, and many of these fraternities dedicated themselves to the patriotic cause of unifying the fatherland. In a famous demonstration in the fall of 1817, on the 300th anniversary of Luther's nailing his 95 Theses on the church door, students from many universities gathered to demonstrate for change, and they gathered at the castle where Luther had hid from his opponents. And who do you think was one of the 4 faculty sponsors of the event? You guessed it, Lawrence Oken. Naturally, reports of the meeting made it into Isis. But as the leaders of the German states worked to restore what had been so disrupted by the French Revolution and by Napoleon, they were hardly ready to endorse the students' demands for unification. How was Germany to be united? Which state would supply the king? And what would be the status of existing sovereign princes? In their view, it was a time to restore order, not create chaos. But that's what they saw the students to be doing. And as Oken's Isis became more and more openly critical of political authorities, under the cause of open discussion, of course, the authorities determined that something had to be done. So, Oken was given a choice: cease publication of Isis or lose your professorship at Jena University. The decision wasn't a difficult one for Oken. He was too committed to his cause. He chose to resign his teaching position and move Isis, which was enjoying great popularity, to another city where he would be allowed to publish. And Isis continued to appear, except for the famous number 195 from December of 1817. That contained the report on the student demonstrations, and it was confiscated. Incidentally, it's still hard to find it in libraries to this day. I recall looking for it in Harvard's Widener Library. The whole run of Isis was there, except for the famous number 195. Well, Oken showed good sense and at least toned down the rhetoric after he moved to Leipzig. He'd given the world the first open journal of natural science, and he'd done so in a way that drew attention, great attention, to the values he associated with science: open discussion and debate. But he wasn't through. He determined that the time was ripe for another experiment, this time the establishment of a modern scientific society. The founding of a society for natural science greatly accelerated the congealing of a scientific community. Up to this point, gatherings of those interested in the study of nature were often local groups. They usually had a narrow focus within the natural sciences. There were exceptions to this, of course. We've already met the Royal Society in England and the Académie des Sciences in France. And in Germany, there were Akademien der Wissenschaften, like the one in Göttingen that had been established in the middle of the 18th century. But these were exclusive societies. They weren't open to just anyone interested in natural science. So once again, it was Oken who took the lead in creating a new society for German natural science. Because it was the first such organization, it would become a model for others, as we'll see. He came at it with the same spirit of openness that he'd cherished in his journal. So he used ISIS to call a meeting to be held in Leipzig in September of 1822. The purpose was to organize the Gesellschaft Deutscher Naturforscher und Ärzte, the Society of German Investigators and Physicians. 13 participants showed up, approximately half of which were physicians and half researchers. Now, this doesn't sound like much of a start, but in fact it was. This small group of organizers caught Oken's vision and decided to meet annually. They would meet in different cities of Germany, alternating between southern, northern, eastern, and western locations. One of Oken's goals was to bring together those working in closely related fields to stimulate collaboration among individuals who might otherwise be unaware of each other. It was sound logic. All the group had to do was to sell the natural philosophers at large on the idea. But for that task, Oken had his journal ready to hand. Oken insisted on something else. He knew that there were disagreements among natural philosophers about fundamental matters that had to do with natural science. So he required that the annual meetings also have social gatherings as an essential feature of the conference. His idea was to promote informal interchange in the hope that participants would learn to balance their sometimes strong disagreements about issues of natural science with the greater unity that moments of shared enjoyment provided. As you can see, the basic ingredients of modern scientific conferences are all here. To say the least, the idea of a national society with an annual conference open to all was a tremendous success. The 1828 meeting, for example, was held in Berlin, where the King of Prussia attended an evening social occasion for participants with spouses, and some 1,200 persons came. The inaugural address was given by the grand old man of German science, Alexander von Humboldt, whom the King of Prussia had just called home to Germany after his long sojourn in Paris. In his address, Humboldt suggested, and the participants agreed, to create 7 individual sections of natural science and medicine. This marked an early step in the direction of the specialization of natural scientific research. 4 years later, the GDNA held its first international meeting in Vienna. Now, in spite of these successes, we can't yet say that natural philosophers had become professionalized. But the word Naturwissenschaftler, natural scientist, would very soon make its way into the German language, and with it would come the idea that there was a practitioner of natural science. Those who pursued research in natural science had acquired a greater social visibility than they ever had before. It would not be long before German universities began to create separate faculties for natural science, breaking away from the old parent philosophy faculty that they'd been part of. That happened at different times in different universities over the course of the 19th century. And companies began to hire these Naturwissenschaftler to conduct research of interest to them. So there was a newly recognized practitioner of natural science. Can we ask what this new natural scientist believed about science? We're going to do that very thing in a second, but first I want to tell you about the effect the German society had on British science. The German success served as a model for British investigators of nature to organize their own society. To see how that came about, we have to take stock of the situation in Britain in these years. During the 1820s in Britain, there was concern among certain of the younger natural philosophers that Britain was falling behind in natural science. Let me tell you a story that will serve to illustrate the mood. Charles Babbage, a mathematician from London, had received a stipend from the government to begin building a calculating machine that he'd designed. By the late 1820s, he ran out of funds, and he resented having to go hat in hand to persuade either the government or the Royal Society to support continuing the project. He couldn't understand why the value of scientific research was not more widely recognized by political authorities. and even by those who graced the hallowed halls of official scientific institutions like the Royal Society. Now, Babbage wasn't alone in complaining about the lack of support that scientific research had. His close friend from undergraduate days, the astronomer John Herschel, shared his impatience. Herschel was the son of the famous astronomer William Herschel, who had emigrated to England from Germany in the middle of the 18th century. And he shared Babbage's, that is, John, shared Babbage's pessimism about the future of English science. In 1828, he wrote to an acquaintance that, and I'm quoting, "It is idle for us to attempt competition with our continental neighbors, whether French or German, in matters of science. We are rapidly dropping behind in the race." Then in 1830, Babbage published a book entitled Reflections on the Decline of Science in England. As you can imagine, it caused a great stir because of its attempt to expose English science as second class. In addition, Babbage openly criticized the Royal Society of London for being dominated by members who were far more interested in aristocratic status than in scientific achievement. And here's where the German meetings came in. Babbage had been the sole Englishman to attend the Berlin meeting of the GDNA in 1828, which he then described to his fellow British countrymen in a journal article. The experience inspired the British to create their own national scientific organization. When more positive reports filtered across the channel about the 1830 German meeting, which was held in Hamburg, several of the younger British natural philosophers decided to take action. So an announcement went out for a general scientific meeting at York in September of 1831. The response? Not quite the same as in Germany. Local philosophical societies in the urban centers and the manufacturing towns, they were enthusiastic, but those associated with what's been called the scientific clerisy, the aristocracy, gentry, clergy, and established academics interested in natural science, these were distrustful of the new venture and tended to send their regrets. But the organizers plowed ahead and set up a structure largely modeled on Oken's successful German organization. Well, those who did attend the York meeting deemed it a rousing success. Here at the 1831 meeting, they declared the formation of the new British Association for the Advancement of Science. The organizers decided to take the movement to the doubters, so they scheduled the next two meetings to be held in the venerable academic centers of Oxford and Cambridge. It would be virtually impossible for the professors of natural philosophy to stay away completely. And in fact, they didn't. Each year, the meeting showed rapidly increasing attendance. Whatever hesitancy the so-called scientific clerisy had once had about disrupting older traditions, it no longer mattered. They were clearly not in control. As in Germany, the new society focused attention on open exchange of ideas in common disciplinary interests, combined with social occasions that diffused animosities and promoted goodwill. And also, like the Germans, the British moved the annual gathering from city to city, to be sure to demonstrate a sense of inclusiveness for all who wished to participate. Finally, the British also instituted the practice of a keynote or inaugural address by a prominent individual who would challenge them to carry on the cause. It was during the Cambridge meeting of 1833 that the British asked the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a longtime friend of those who sought to encounter and understand nature, to deliver the inaugural address. And it was somewhat ironic since, like Oken, Coleridge also had gone to Jena in his youth to study the nature philosophy of Schelling. In his remarks to the gathering, Coleridge forbade members of the BAAS to call themselves philosophers, the traditional title some still preferred. They were different from philosophers, he said. It was in response to this challenge thrown down by Coleridge that William Whewell, master of Trinity College, coined the word scientist at the Cambridge meeting as a term that designated those who studied material nature. The following year, he used the new name in print in a review, and finally, in his book on the philosophy of the inductive sciences of 1840, Whewell wrote, "We need very much a name to describe a cultivator of science in general. I should incline to describe him a scientist." Well, there were those who despised the new term. Not surprisingly, the leading critic was one of those natural philosophers well ensconced in a university position as a natural philosopher. He had no reason to want to change things. It might open up the gates to include those, perish the thought, outside the university. But such individuals were behind the times. The new term was here to stay. It was true that as yet there weren't a lot of job possibilities for scientists outside a professorship in a university somewhere, but the government survey was hiring those trained in geology, and more opportunities like that would begin to emerge. So there was a new social identity on the horizon. There was a practitioner of natural science, and it emerged right at the time when all kinds of attention was coming the way of natural science. There was the publication of the many volumes of von Humboldt's Cosmos, beginning in the late 30s and early 40s. There were the tales of Darwin's voyages. There was the sensational issues raised by Combs' book on phrenology, and then Chambers' book on the vestiges of the natural history of creation. There were the discoveries of new planets and the building of huge telescopes, both of which we have yet to talk about. There were the claims made by the Germans that natural science somehow was linked to political revolution, and also that the new outlook helped us to expose the scriptures as myths. There was the link between natural science and a strictly deterministic scientific materialism. There were assertions that we have to change our idea about the end of the world. And to top it all off, there was Darwin's origin. Now, admittedly, there were many who continued not to be all that interested in these issues having to do with natural science, but that kind of position was becoming increasingly hard to maintain. Natural science had a way of intruding into your world regardless of who you were. More and more it became something you felt forced to have an opinion about. And now there were these natural scientists who seemed to speak for natural science at annual meetings. So what kind of image of natural science did these new scientists tend to impart? If they were now the socially recognized authorities, what did they say science was, and how did it differ from the older natural philosophy? It would, of course, take some time for the new role in 19th century society to become firmly established. But when the leaders of the new scientific society spoke, they did carry a kind of authority that communicated more of a consensus than had been present in earlier years. For one thing, scientists seemed to agree that their enterprise was more narrowly focused than it had been when there was still natural philosophy. There we saw that there were at least two metaphors that were used for nature, the machine and the organism. With the emergence of the natural scientists, the appeal to nature as organism diminished, and the image of nature as machine increased. There were a couple of books in the 1840s that tried to spell out why natural science was different from what Schelling and the Romantics had been up to. By mid-century, it was no longer acceptable to identify yourself as a nature philosopher in Europe. It was a different story, incidentally, here in the United States. Along with that came an accompanying feature. The task of the natural scientist, at least of the physical scientist, became more and more to find nature's mechanisms. And that meant that mechanics became the supreme science. Mechanics and logic are identical, said Wilhelm Wundt around mid-century. He meant that the scientist had explained something about nature's working if he or she had identified the mechanism that was responsible for it. It was clearly that old view of nature, drawn as if one stood outside of nature. It was the view the Romantics so regretted. In the waning years of his career, Goethe wrote with prophetic accuracy, around 1830, to a correspondent that it would be a long time before the view of things they shared would return. One final observation about the emergence of a consensus concerning how natural science was to be pursued. Remember back in Lecture 13 that the new science of biology had been born in the midst of the flourishing of the view of nature as romantic? Scholars have recently been pointing out that in spite of the consensus that was claimed by the new scientific community of the middle of the 19th century, the goals of what I've occasionally referred to as romantic science did not die completely. The historian Robert Richards has very recently demonstrated impressively how very explicit it remained in the German tradition, even found its way into Darwin by way of Alexander von Humboldt. In other words, it continued to hover beneath the surface, and there was additional evidence of the concern to retain moral agency at the heart of natural science, in spite of what the new consensus said. That was in the continued flourishing of what now began to be known as alternative scientific practices. Mesmerism, homeopathy, phrenology, and a myriad of other systems were now alternative to a standard model. But now we have scientists and they're pretty much agreed about what it is they do. In our next lecture, we'll see how these new scientists come to one of the major insights of the 19th century, the conservation of energy.